as well. So we'll have our meeting for our special interest group if you're interested in attending. Okay.
All right.
So we initially started this project, and like I mentioned before, we thought the significance of a toolkit would really be to provide faculty and practitioners with that range of quality information, resources, and tools for service learning. And the goal of creating this toolkit or resources would be to provide service project ideas, as well as those resources. So if we can see and capture what other faculty are doing, it can actually stem and give people ideas. Hey, I can easily replicate that in my classroom. And it might even be a platform for building mentorships or building research on those projects. So for example, if we're doing service learning, we were talking about designing a survey that we can provide and give to the students either before and then after the class on their perception of service learning and emergency management and what they're capturing or getting out of it. And if by doing that across many universities, it'll be a great opportunity for collaboration, and then looking within our specialty field, right?
And so if you're interested in SOTL, right, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, this is a ready-made area that is ripe for that sort of scholarship. And we've been having some discussions about that. And really, one of the things that I know I work with my faculty on, so a lot of faculty at my institution that try to work with service learning tend to be the junior faculty, right? And they do it on top of their own research agenda. And of course, my view is always work smarter, not harder. And so it's mentoring them to use this also to further their research agenda, which then helps, they've got multiple things in each pot, right? So we very much see this, and this is really using it in research, using it as evaluative, using it as assessment, all these sorts of things. This is where, so service learning has been around now for quite a while, but it's still really largely seen as a pedagogy, and it is. And we're just now beginning to see the beginnings of research into it at a sort of a longitudinal level, right? Mm-hmm. So we're coming in right at at a really good time to really think about how we can use this to demonstrate the competencies and things like that. So all of the things that we've been hearing about in plenaries, sort of funnels into what we're talking about here.
And that being said, it's been really interesting. Throughout this past year, I've actually connected with a lot of faculty from New Zealand, from New Orleans, from New York, I went down to Puerto Rico a couple weeks ago to learn about what they're using in pertaining to service learning and experiential learning in post-disaster recovery. And it's really fascinating because the schools are really, they thought about this afterwards. So a lot of their programs were developed, or their projects were developed like years after the incident had occurred within these cities, besides Puerto Rico, because we're working very closely with them. But what ended up happening is they saw the benefit of having all these faculty and supporting these faculty in creating service learning projects to support efforts in recovery after Katrina, after Sandy, after the Church Christ earthquakes in New Zealand. And now the professors in New Zealand are actually flying out the students from the shooting in Florida over to New Zealand, I think next week, to learn about what it means to be actively engaged in policy, and especially after a major event has occurred. So those Parkland students will actually get a chance to learn from other students that were very proactive and developed programs in their schools to focus on bridging that gap between academia and practice. So if we get ahead of the game and we think of it in our cities that if something has occurred, I'm already plugged in, I already know the right people, I already have a system of how I can engage projects into my classroom, you're going to be way ahead of the game when something does occur. So the significance for academia, with historical research, we did a literature review. There's not a whole lot, but just in the last few years we have publications by Tom Carey, Knox and Harris, and Capuzzi and Knox as well. And a lot of it has to do within the realm of public affairs.
Yeah.
So it's very centric, but I mean, a lot of the research does span over into other areas, but they're coming from that mentality of a public affairs approach. And that's why we do definitely need other areas as well to kind of chime in and see where we can expand upon this pedagogy.
And certainly we can learn. One of the things that, and once again, it was just presented this morning, that as we engage in this, we begin to look at other areas of literature that bring in service learning, right? So nursing is an area that is very heavily experiential learning based, right? So in my own work, I pulled from the nursing literature. I'm in criminal justice. So, you know, that service learning is still being incorporated in interesting ways in that field, but I've been able to pull some from there. So one thing to really think about is that even if you're like me, so I am not in a program of emergency management, I'm actually in the Department of Criminal Justice, right? So my sort of way of incorporating service learning into my Homeland Security classroom both has to meet the program objectives of my criminal justice program, as well as what I see are competencies, right? So we absolutely want to pull in from these different areas to strengthen what we can provide the emergency management field. So,
and the same thing here is I'm in a public health, college of public health. So yeah, we do have our competencies for public health, but we want to make sure that we meet both of those. So it's very interesting when it was so easy to find publications on public health specifically, or criminology, or nursing, or different areas, but when you're talking about really thinking about emergency management, like a lot of them might be doing nursing projects or things that pertain to their field within the realm of emergency response or preparedness, but when you look at their framework, they're really, the foundation of them is in their college or in their discipline, not necessarily aligned with what emergency management competencies are, or best practices in emergency management, because there are some projects that I saw and I'm like, oh my, it's not something that I would do. But what we want to do is we want you to kind of think and talk with us a little bit about what you think are the advantages and disadvantages of service learning and emergency management.
So just before we actually go on, who's a faculty member? Okay, who's a practitioner? Okay, who's sort of on both, right? Yeah, you can put up the both hands, right? That's okay.
I like how they were like,
yeah, it's, right. You know, one of the benefits of what we have here is that if you wear both hats, think about it with both hats. So what do students get when you see them in your agencies? What do students get when you think about them in your classroom? Where have been some challenges, and maybe that you've had, just in thinking about introducing practice into your classrooms? And who's ever done service learning before? Okay, all right, so, you know, maybe a couple of you can talk about particularly your experience